central to Said's ideas about Orientalism was the linkage between knowledge and power. For all practical purposes, we no longer live in that colonial world. We talk about Islamophobia in the Norwegian context. Islamophobia is often linked to the idea that Muslims oppress women. One of the predominant forms that Islamophobia is taking at present is anti-Palestinian racism, a transnational alliance between far-right and racist actors from the US via Europe to Israel. We talk about Islamophobia in the Norwegian context. Islamophobia is often linked to the idea that Muslims oppress women. You know, Muslims are here to stay in Europe, right? So it's not as if these right-wing extremist ideas about remigration and expulsion from Europe is ever going to materialize.
Hello everyone, welcome again to another episode of Marginalized Notes podcast. I'm Ruba Abed and my guest today is the anthropologist Sindre Bangstad. He is a visiting professor at Princeton University, a research professor at KIFO Institute in Norway, and he's an author of a very interesting book on the incident of Andres Pervik. The book was published in 2014 and it discusses the rise of Islamophobia in Norway. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much, Ruba.
So, Professor Bangstad, you've been given a very interesting award, the Amy Award, for your efforts in facilitating anthropological knowledge to a wider audience through media. To what extent do you think the efforts on bridging the gap between academia and the public sphere are important?
Well, to me, public engagement and trying to reach an audience beyond my immediate discipline has always been crucially important in terms of how I identify and what I do. It has to be said that in my discipline, and in other disciplines as well, it's not always a priority that brings you acknowledgement and recognition, because there's also been in the last few decades a drive towards specialization, right, in ever more and narrower fields within the discipline, so that the discipline as such does not necessarily speak to or even try to engage a wider audience. And so therefore I was also very pleased with this recognition from the American Anthropological Association back in 2019 when I was awarded this Anthropology in the Media Award for my attempts to bridging those gaps. And I do think, funding for academic work has different sources, right? So in my native country, the main source of the funding is the state, right? And so the way I think about it is that we, as academics who are after all in a very privileged position, have a responsibility towards a wider public and a wider society, right, in terms of what we try to do.
How would the public find anthropology useful?
Well, I think certainly in my own home country of Norway, anthropology is, of course, generally known as the study of man, right? And the historical idea or the idea that is there present in the public imagination about what anthropology is as a discipline and what anthropologists do has to do with anthropological ethnographic studies, as we refer to it, in faraway places, right? So my work on Islamophobia and racism in Norway is also part of a move within the discipline to study one's own societies and developments within one's own society. Yeah, but I do think that the general sense of what anthropology is in Norway is also one of set of weird characters studying people in faraway and remote corners of the world. Right?
Mm. Okay, so if we bring this to action, considering that you are an influential voice about working on Muslims in Europe and issues of Islamophobia and racism, what is Islamophobia?
So there are, as with any concept, numerous definitions. One thing I'd like to say about this by way of introduction is that people think that this is something that a term which really emerged in the course of the 1990s and which sort of pivoted after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, 2001. But if we look at the history of the concept itself, it actually, and this, there's a Spanish historian who has studied this, and he found that the term first appears in print in French as early as in 1910 in the work of two French Africanists and colonial administrators in what was then French West Africa. So it's much more. It's a much older term than what we generally think. If we look at the sort of Anglophone sphere, the term makes its first appearance in the work of the late and great Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said in an essay he published in 1985, Orientalism Reconsidered. So what is Islamophobia? In my book on this, which was published in 2014, I used a definition from a Swedish historian of religion by the name of Mattias Gardell. He refers to Islamophobia as socially reproduced prejudices and aversions against Islam and Muslims, and actions and practices which attack, exclude, and discriminate against people either being or being presumed to be Muslim and to be associated with Islam. So what is important here is that Gardell does not reduce Islamophobia to a set of individual attitudes. We also have to think of Islamophobia in terms of social practices that target Muslims or even people presumed to be Muslim, right? Because you can actually be a target of Islamophobia even though you're not of Muslim background or you don't practice Islam.
Well, considering the fact that the term has a history, there is a historical, maybe a trajectory or development of the term, and perhaps it holds different meanings, maybe different times to some extent. Can we say that there are different types of Islamophobia across history and maybe in the contemporary time?
Yeah, certainly, because Islamophobia also depends on, or the actual expression of Islamophobia depends on specific contexts and both temporally and geographically, right? So if we look at this in a global perspective, I've been involved with a research project funded by the Norwegian Research Council entitled Intersect, Global and Intersecting Flows of Islamophobia. And there we tried not only to identify the specific forms it takes in very different contexts. So comparing, for example, Islamophobia in Norway and in Myanmar. But also trying to figure out the transnational flows between various forms of Islamophobia. So how does Islamophobic tropes, as we refer to them, or ideas pertaining to Islamophobia travel. And obviously also, the historical ideas pertaining to Islamophobia may also change. To give you one example, right, this difference, if we compare Islamophobia in Myanmar with Islamophobia in Norway, right? In Norway, you don't have this idea that, they share the sense in both forms of Islamophobia that Muslims are threatening, right? They're sort of enemies within, if you like. But there's a distinction in that the general idea about why Muslims represent a threat in a country like Norway would not be linked to the idea that Muslims are in possession of great wealth. That's different in Myanmar, where Islamophobia would be linked to an idea that Muslims are threatening because they're so wealthy, right?
So you're saying that we should consider the intersectional nature of when we come to understand Islamophobia, we need to consider factors like race, gender, and class.
Absolutely. So the crucial point here is, how do various facets intersect? I mean, if we talk about Islamophobia in the Norwegian context, Islamophobia is often linked to the idea that Muslims oppress women, right? So that's and that has to be seen in the context of Norwegian liberal and hegemonic ideas about gender equality, right? So that's something Norwegians generally take a great pride in that we're rated very highly when it comes to gender equality, and rightly so. But the idea that Muslims are inherently oppressive of women is, of course, where it becomes problematic. Politically, we may also speak of different forms, right? So there's a liberal form of Islamophobia in which these concerns about gender are very central in a place like Norway. There's also the idea that Muslims are, by virtue of their adherence to Islam, inherently opposed to freedom of speech, for example, right? If we go to far and racist Islamophobia, which in the Norwegian context, given that we've had two terrorist attacks, one in 2011 and a copycat attempt in 2019, the first of which, in which 77 people were murdered in two terrorist attacks on government headquarters and a social democratic youth summer camp at an island outside of Oslo. In 2019, it was an attempted attack on Muslims in prayer at a mosque near Oslo. And in that context, the far and racist forms of Islamophobia is anchored in the idea that Muslims represent a threat by virtue of the fact that they actually want to take over Europe, right? The right-wing extremist attacks in 2011, the perpetrator there, prior to the attack, published a 1,715 pages cut and paste tract which outlined some of his ideas, and this was far-right and racist Islamophobia, in which he envisioned that these attacks would unleash a civil war in Europe, leading to the ultimate expulsion of all Muslims from Europe. So that was the idea, right?
Well, speaking of terrorist attacks, and looking also at Islamophobia, usually the media would, the narrative that we're used to, that whenever terrorism is taken for granted and it is attributed to, it is never presented as a an individual incident. Usually, immediately, even effectively on the public, it immediately connotates that this has to be a Muslim, and this is what a Muslim, what usually Muslims do. But when it comes to other kind of violent attacks that could be seen as terrorism, but they're not. Let's say they had an Islamophobic narrative. They're usually represented as a individual incident. But these both actions, they seem to actually parallel each other, which suggests that Islamophobia has a multi-layered structure. There are so many circumstances that feed into this phenomena, while the narrative, maybe legally or in the media, it doesn't necessarily present it as such. So what is your take on that?
I think as a general statement about the narrative framing and the media framing of terrorist attacks, when we compare perpetrators that are motivated by right-wing extremist ideologies of Islamophobia and say Salafi jihadist, generally holds, right? So there's a strong tendency to sort of individualize attacks coming from right-wing extremist perpetrators, so that they're not seen as expressions of general tendencies within the wider society from which they emerge. And in the case of perpetrators that happen to have a Muslim background, they would be generally seen as ideologically motivated. So the book that I wrote about this was at its core, it's an attempt to problematize that very distinction, right? Because the right-wing extremist perpetrators in Norway come from certain places, right? And have been profoundly motivated by Islamophobic ideas and tropes.
Since we've been talking about Islamophobia for the past maybe 15 minutes, to what extent is the Muslim experience different if we compare it to other minority groups? Whether if we're going to talk about like Europe in general, or if you have any specific examples from Norway.
Yeah, well, I think that there's been a long-standing tendencies within Western and European societies to stigmatize minorities, right? So, and that may change over time. What specific minorities we're talking about, right? If we were to be specific about the case of Norway, for example, right? So, mass immigration to Norway started with labor migrants in the late 1960s, early 1970s, right? Before that, there wasn't much of a Muslim presence to speak of in Norway. Muslims now make up an estimated 3.5% of the population. Within the Muslim population itself, those that have sort of succeeded reasonably well in terms of education and so forth are second-generation Muslims, most particularly from the Norwegian Pakistani population, right? So you'd find a lot of medical doctors, dentists, pharmacists, and so forth among Norwegian Pakistanis, and the stigmatization that their parents experienced in the 1960s and 1970s have lessened. But one could argue that it has shifted over to other Muslim minority groups, and more specifically the Norwegian Somali population, which are certainly, if you look at labor market indicators and social indicators, they're worst off in the Muslim population in Norway today.
Yeah, I wanted to know if the victimhood maybe, or the experience of Muslims, considering that they are a minority in European context, is it unique? Is it different if we compare to other groups that are easily, or their racialization is easier? But here in the Muslim case, we have Muslims themselves, Muslim migrants in European countries. They are diverse groups, but they have been like maybe racialized twice. Once that has to do with their appearance, where they come from, their color, the color of the skin, and then there's another layer that has been racialized, which is the layer of Islam. Does this make their experiences different or more complex than other groups?
Yeah, because as you indicate, that there's a multi-layeredness to it, right? But if we look at the racialization of minorities in Europe historically, you'd also find that it's useful here to think in terms of historical analogies with, for example, Jews in Europe, right? Just to sort of mention the Norwegian context here, I mean, Jews were prohibited from entry to the Kingdom of Norway by virtue of the Constitution of 1814, right? And you find a lot of sort of racialization of Jews leading up to the tragedy of the Holocaust, in which Norwegian police officers, for example, willingly participated by the occupying in the German Nazi occupying forces rounding up Norwegian Jews for deportation to the concentration camps in Poland.
There is a trend, let's say, of reverse migrations of Muslim migrants in Europe to Muslim majority countries, and it has been happening for some time. And there are papers and some good research that have been done about this. For example, one of the highlight location for this migration is Turkey at the moment, or maybe it had been for maybe the past few years. How is it really that there is no hope anymore for Muslims in Europe, or are there other consequences or circumstances that are contributing to this trend, that we cannot only see it from the lens or the filter of Islamophobia, but also economy and other layers?
One would probably have to look at specific country contexts in order to say something more general about this. But I mean, motivations for migration may be more complex than that, right? Because there might be economic opportunities that people see, and generally, I'd say, if I look at this from now a Norwegian perspective, Norway is sort of a very advanced welfare state, right? So, and it comes with a lot of freedoms, right? So that there is this layer of Islamophobia, of discrimination in the labor market, in housing and so forth. But there's not much of this return migration as a phenomenon in Norway, not that I'm aware of, at least. Also because people know that it's a safe country. There are opportunities if you get a higher education and so forth. And I think it's important to say, by way of conclusion to this, that the lesson to be drawn here, I think, is that Muslims are here to stay in Europe, right? So it's not as if these right-wing extremist ideas about remigration and expulsion from Europe is ever going to materialize. And so on the part of non-Muslim Europeans, the onus is rather to get used to that fact, right? and find ways of living together peacefully and constructively.
We've spoken about Islamophobia, the fact that there is a historical trajectory. The term has existed for a long time, regardless of to what extent was it popular. You also mentioned maybe slightly that even when we look at Islamophobia, because usually we take this idea for granted that it is a trend that started to appear in media, and this is how it was influenced in the public awareness, especially after 9/11. But from this conversation, I understand that there is something structural about it. There is something that goes it is a more complex phenomenon. So, considering this heavy context, what strategies maybe that would be useful in fighting back such a phenomena that can be socially destructive?
So there is in the general literature about racism and discrimination, right? There is an assumption that if people get to know one another, social distance decreases. I think it has to be emphasized here that this also means more sustained contact, right? So it's not as if having dinner with a Muslim would necessarily lessen your tendency towards discrimination and so forth. It has to be a common activity over time. But when it comes to what we're talking about here, is really the art of living together peacefully. What my great and illustrious friend, Professor Paul Gilroy, has referred to as conviviality, right? And conviviality isn't, in Gilroy's terms, unproblematic. It's not this a romantic idea that as long as we get to know each other, we will live peacefully together. But I don't think there's any other way, than for people to interact on a daily and everyday level if we're going to deal with this phenomenon as well. Now, I do think also that the state has a responsibility here. What we're seeing in wider Europe and the US today is, of course, profoundly unsettling and troubling, because one of the predominant forms that Islamophobia is taking at present is anti-Palestinian racism. And we're seeing the contours of a transnational alliance between far-right and racist actors from the US via Europe to Israel, right? So these forces are now more coordinated than they ever been, and unfortunately, it doesn't look like a passing phenomenon. So we might expect in the years to come a much more troubling scenario than we have even now. And Islamophobia is real, racism is real in European societies. But I think we're seeing the contours of hardening forms of this, which certainly makes people like me very worried.
This brings me back to the very beginning of the conversation. So considering the multi-layered nature of Islamophobia as a phenomenon and how it can actually be quite flexible and fluid to add even a wider groups, maybe generally Arabs, for example, as you mentioned, how it is kind of feeding into aggression or racism against Palestinians. This brings me back to the very beginning of the question, of the conversation. When we try to define Islamophobia, the complex nature of this term and everything that comes with it makes it sound as if it is an extension of Orientalism, and it is a problem of stereotype, also a problem that needs a lot of knowledge to fight back, which is why another reason why bridging the gap between academia and the public sphere is important. Do you agree with?
Yeah, I mean, if we think of differences and similarity, right? In this conference, there's been a lot of references to the great work of the late Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said on Orientalism, right? But in terms of similarities and differences between Orientalism as conceived by Said and Islamophobia and Neo-Orientalism, I do think that the terrain has shifted significantly. I mean, central to Said's ideas about Orientalism was the linkage between knowledge and power. So that Orientalism as a set of ideas about the people of the East or Muslims were premised on a link between colonialism, European colonialism, and Orientalism. For all practical purposes, we no longer live in that colonial world, right? So, fortunately, there was a huge and massively important for most people in the world, and I don't think Europeans necessarily understand this as well as they ought to, right? How important decolonization was as a process, right? But we're no longer in that world. But that's not to say that we are no longer living in a world of coloniality. In other words, a world in which colonial attitudes come to expression within European and Western societies. So in a sense, these decolonial scholars are right when they say that colonialism must be considered not as an historical event, but an ongoing process. But I do think it's important also to underline here that the Muslim object of Orientalism in Said's conception was conceived as exotic, primitive, uncivilized. So you find a lot of these tropes also in Islamophobia, but I do think that Islamophobia as such is different in the sense that in Orientalism there isn't necessarily this far-right and racist ideas that the problem with Muslims is that they're coming to our societies, right? So you don't have that, and Islamophobia as such is a way of othering that is much more anchored in negative sets of attitudes and ideas concerning Muslims than perhaps Orientalism was historically.
Actively looking at Islamophobia as an extension of Orientalism can maybe at the end jeopardize the argument of looking at it as a problem.
Yeah, so we need to look at both similarities and differences, right?
Thank you, Dr. Sindre Bangstad. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you have a very pleasant stay at Doha.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Pleasure is mine.